She spent decades quietly cleaning rooms no one noticed, her dignity swallowed by the same walls that hid her pain. To them, she was invisible, just an old maid with no power, no voice, no worth. But the day the millionaire's wife leaned in and reminded her, "You depend on me now," something shifted. Not anger, not fear, something far more dangerous. Because what no one in that mansion knew was this: she had a past they couldn't imagine, and a single call could destroy everything they thought they controlled. So why did she smile? For most people in that mansion, she was just part of the background, like the polished floors she cleaned or the silver trays she carried without a sound. Her name was rarely spoken, and when it was, it came with a tone that reminded her exactly where she stood. An old black maid, working long hours, living quietly, asking for nothing. But her life hadn't always been so small. Long before the uniform, before the bowed head and careful steps, she had built something of her own, something that had been taken from her in ways no one there would ever understand. Years of silence had taught her how to survive, how to endure, how to become invisible when the world decided she didn't matter. The millionaire's wife, with her sharp eyes and colder words, saw her as replaceable, someone to control, someone who needed this job to survive. And maybe on the surface that looked true. The long hours, the quiet obedience, it all fit the story they believed about her. But there was something they didn't see, something hidden beneath the routine, beneath the silence, a past that refused to stay buried, and a connection that still held power. Because in that house where everything seemed controlled, one small moment was about to shift everything. And no one was ready for what came next. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in slowly, through glances that lingered too long, through instructions that sounded less like requests and more like quiet commands. The millionaire's wife had always been demanding, but now there was something sharper in her tone, something that made it clear she wasn't just giving orders. She was asserting control. Tasks became tests. Every movement was watched, every small mistake magnified. A glass placed slightly off-center became a reason for criticism. A delay of a few seconds turned into a lecture about knowing her place. The words were carefully chosen, never loud enough to cause a scene, but heavy enough to leave a mark. And every time the message was the same, subtle but unmistakable. You are here because we allow it. The other staff noticed it too, though no one said a word. They kept their heads down, moving quickly, avoiding eye contact. In that house, silence wasn't just survival, it was protection. Because speaking up didn't fix things. It only made you the next target. But for her, something was different. Each insult didn't break her, it sharpened her. Every dismissive look, every quiet humiliation, it all built into something deeper. Not anger that exploded, but something controlled, something patient. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was late afternoon, the kind of quiet hour where the house felt almost still. She was in the main hall, finishing her work, when the millionaire's wife approached. No raised voice, no dramatic scene, just a calm, deliberate step forward, and that same cold expression. That was when she said it, a sentence so simple yet so loaded it seemed to freeze the air around them, a reminder of dependence, of power, of who mattered and who didn't. For a second, nothing moved. The walls, the silence, even the distant sounds of the house seemed to fade. Anyone watching might have expected her to lower her head, to nod, to accept it the way she always had. But this time, she didn't. Instead, something almost unnoticeable happened. A pause, a shift, and then she smiled. Not the polite, quiet smile they were used to, not the one that kept things smooth and predictable. This was different, controlled, certain. And that was the moment everything began to unravel. Because what followed wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen in front of everyone. It started with a single quiet step away, and a decision that would soon shake the very foundation of that house. The house was quiet, but no longer in control. Minutes after she stepped away, something began to shift. At first, it was subtle. A phone call placed in silence. No urgency, no panic, just calm precision. The kind that comes from someone who already knows how this ends. Then the knock came. Not soft, not hesitant, firm, official. The millionaire's wife froze the moment she heard it. This wasn't expected. Nothing ever arrived unannounced in her world. And yet as the doors opened, The balance of power she had always relied on began to crack. People stepped inside, calm, composed, and impossible to ignore. Their presence alone changed the air. Questions were asked. Names were mentioned. Documents surfaced. Things buried long ago were no longer. For the first time, the woman who controlled everything had no script to follow, no command to give, no way to silence what was unfolding in front of her. And there she stood, the maid. Not in the background, not invisible, watching. The years of dismissal, the quiet insults, the weight of being treated as less, it all led to this moment. But there was no anger on her face, no desperation, just a quiet certainty, as if she had been waiting. Not for revenge, but for truth to finally arrive, because the call she made wasn't random. It reached people who knew exactly who she was, people who remembered what had been taken from her, and who had been responsible. The mansion, the wealth, the power, it was all connected to a past that had been carefully buried beneath privilege and silence. Now it was being uncovered piece by piece in real time. The millionaire's wife tried to speak, to regain control, but her voice no longer carried weight. The room had shifted. The narrative had changed. And in that moment, one truth became impossible to ignore. The woman they thought had nothing, had everything they feared. By the time the sun set, the mansion no longer felt untouchable. The same walls that once silenced everything were now holding the weight of truth. Investigations had begun. Names that carried power were now being questioned. And the woman who once believed she controlled everything stood in a space where control no longer belonged to her. As for the maid, she didn't stay. Not because she was forced to leave, but because she finally chose to. For the first time in years, she walked out without lowering her head, without shrinking herself to fit someone else's idea of worth. The uniform she once wore like a symbol of survival no longer defined her. What they never understood was this: she was never powerless. She was patient. The injustice she endured wasn't loud enough to make headlines. It lived in small moments, dismissive looks, quiet humiliation, the constant reminder that her value was seen as less. And that's how it often happens in the real world. Not always through dramatic acts, but through everyday behavior that slowly strips away dignity. But this time it didn't stay hidden. This time it was exposed. And maybe that's the part that matters most. Because her story isn't just about one house, one woman, or one moment. It's about a system that too often underestimates, overlooks, and silences until it's forced to confront the truth. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fight back the way they expected. She simply reminded them of something they chose to forget. Respect is not something you give based on status, it's something every human deserves. So the question is, how many more stories like hers are still hidden, behind closed doors, waiting for someone brave enough to make that call?